"Officer, that's him. He's trying to scam this bank." Richard Coleman's voice cracked through the polished marble lobby like a judge delivering a sentence before hearing a single fact. Conversation stopped. The quiet hum of counting machines faded beneath the weight of startled silence. Every customer turned toward the man standing near the premium banking desk, and in an instant dozens of strangers reached the same dangerous conclusion before anyone asked a single question. Nathaniel Brooks didn't flinch. At 48 years old, he stood with the calm confidence of someone who had spent an entire lifetime watching assumptions arrive long before introductions. He wore faded blue jeans, a neatly pressed navy polo, and worn brown loafers that looked more comfortable than expensive. There was no designer watch sparkling beneath the lights, no luxury briefcase resting beside him, no assistant rushing to explain who he was. Just a quiet black man holding a slim leather folder and waiting for a meeting that had been scheduled weeks earlier. Richard marched around the counter, straightening his expensive gray suit as though authority itself lived inside the fabric. "Don't let him leave," he ordered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The police are already on their way." A ripple of whispers spread through the lobby. An elderly woman slowly lowered the financial newspaper she had been reading. A father waiting with his teenage son looked up from his phone. A young couple exchanging mortgage paperwork froze mid-conversation. They searched Nathaniel's face for signs of panic, anger, or guilt. They found none. Instead, Nathaniel calmly adjusted the folder beneath his arm and glanced toward the large windows overlooking downtown Charlotte, North Carolina, where the morning sunlight reflected against rows of office towers. It was 10:12 on a warm Tuesday morning, and the bank had been open for less than 15 minutes. No one could have guessed they were about to witness a moment that would permanently change careers, reputations, and one institution's understanding of respect. "Sir," a security officer said carefully as he approached, "I need you to remain where you are until the officers arrive." Nathaniel met the man's eyes and offered a polite nod. "I wasn't planning to leave." His voice carried no frustration, no sarcasm, no fear. That answer seemed to confuse everyone more than if he had argued. Richard folded his arms with growing confidence, mistaking composure for surrender. "Funny how calm people act when they think they can talk their way out of fraud," he muttered, making sure nearby customers heard every word. Nathaniel looked toward him with an expression that revealed nothing. Years had taught him that dignity often spoke louder than outrage. Around the lobby, phones quietly appeared above purses and coffee cups. A college student sitting near the investment offices unlocked her camera. A businessman standing beside the teller line exchanged uncertain glances with another customer. Something about the scene felt wrong, though few could explain why. Richard noticed the growing attention and lifted his chin even higher. Public confidence mattered, and he believed he was protecting the bank. What he didn't realize was that every confident accusation was building the very record that would soon unravel his career. Outside, the distant sound of approaching sirens drifted through the glass entrance. Several heads turned toward the parking lot. Richard smiled with visible relief. Nathaniel simply remained exactly where he stood, as steady as stone, watching the doors without the slightest hint of urgency, almost as though he had been expecting this moment long before anyone else inside the building realized the day had already taken a turn none of them would ever forget. Ignoring the growing whispers behind him, Nathaniel Brooks slowly walked toward a row of leather chairs near the private banking offices and quietly took a seat without waiting for permission. His movements were deliberate, almost routine, as though he refused to let another person's assumptions dictate the rhythm of his morning. The security officer remained a respectful distance away, uncertain whether he was guarding a suspect or simply following instructions that no longer made complete sense. Richard Coleman watched the scene unfold with growing impatience. In his mind, an innocent man would have been desperate to explain himself, to argue, or to demand an apology. Nathaniel did none of those things. He simply rested the slim leather folder across his lap and folded his hands. That calm unsettled Richard far more than anger ever could. He stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. "You still have not explained why you requested access to our executive conference room," Richard said loudly. "Customers do not just walk in asking for private facilities without proper authorization." Nathaniel looked up with steady eyes. "I scheduled a meeting for 10:15 this morning." Richard let out a short laugh. With whom? Someone expecting me. Several customers exchanged curious glances. The answer sounded strangely confident, yet Richard dismissed it immediately. There is no executive meeting on today's public schedule. Nathaniel gave a polite nod. That does not surprise me. Richard crossed his arms. Enough games. He extended his hand. Hand me your identification again. Without hesitation, Nathaniel opened his wallet and presented his driver's license. Richard barely looked at it before handing it to a nearby teller. Run another verification, he ordered, and make sure every detail matches. The young teller, whose name badge read Emily Foster, accepted the identification with noticeably more hesitation than confidence. 27 years old and less than 2 years into her banking career, Emily had been trained to verify information, not people. As she compared the license to the customer profile on her computer, a faint crease appeared across her forehead. Everything matched perfectly. The address, the date of birth, the photograph. There were no alerts, no restrictions, no fraud notices. She quietly looked back toward Richard. Sir, Richard interrupted before she could finish. Double check it. Emily obeyed, although nothing changed the second time. Nearby, a businessman waiting to discuss a commercial loan leaned toward another customer and whispered, if his identification is valid, why are they still treating him like this? The other man simply shrugged, uncomfortable with the question. Near the entrance, a woman in her early 60s slowly closed her checkbook and continued watching. She had lived long enough to recognize the difference between caution and judgment. Nathaniel remained seated beneath the soft lighting of the lobby, his expression unreadable. Every few seconds his eyes drifted toward the large wall clock above the customer service desk. 10:14, 1 minute before his appointment. Richard noticed the glance and smirked. You keep looking at the clock like someone important is coming. Nathaniel answered with the slightest smile. Someone is. Richard shook his head dismissively. The only people arriving are police officers. Nathaniel's calm never changed. We will both know the truth soon enough. Across the lobby, Emily quietly stared at the customer profile still displayed on her monitor. Something about it refused to leave her mind. It was not what she saw that troubled her. It was what she did not see. For someone requesting a meeting that had clearly been arranged in advance, there should have been a visitor notation somewhere in the internal calendar. Instead, the section was marked confidential, accessible only to senior executives. Emily looked toward Nathaniel once more. For the first time that morning, she began wondering whether the quiet man everyone had already judged knew far more about this bank than anyone standing behind the counter. The faint wail of approaching sirens grew louder outside, but inside the lobby another kind of pressure was beginning to build. Customers no longer whispered only to one another. They were watching Richard Coleman. Every decision he made was becoming part of a story unfolding in real time, whether he realized it or not. Richard refused to notice the shifting atmosphere. Instead, he pointed toward the leather folder resting on Nathaniel Brooks's lap. Set that on the table, he demanded. What is inside? Nathaniel looked down at the folder before calmly raising his eyes again. Private business documents. Richard extended his hand. Then open it. No. The answer came quietly, almost gently, yet it landed across the lobby with surprising weight. Richard frowned. You are refusing to cooperate. I am protecting confidential information. Richard laughed, shaking his head as if the explanation itself proved guilt. Confidential information. That is convenient. He turned toward the security officer. Stay close. He is becoming increasingly suspicious. The officer shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Nathaniel had remained respectful from the moment he entered the building. There had been no raised voice, no threatening behavior, no attempt to leave. None of it matched the picture Richard continued describing. Emily Foster stood behind her workstation pretending to review customer files, but her attention remained fixed on the confidential calendar window displayed on her monitor. She carefully clicked through the internal scheduling system once more. The executive conference room had indeed been reserved for 10:15 that morning. The organizer's identity was hidden behind restricted access, but one detail caught her attention. The reservation carried the highest level of executive authorization available within the bank's internal system. Emily quietly swallowed. Very few people possessed clearance high enough to create meetings under that classification. Before she could think further, Richard called across the lobby. Emily, did you find anything? She hesitated for half a second. His identification is completely valid. Richard answered without looking at her. That was not my question. Emily lowered her voice. There are no irregularities. Richard waved his hand dismissively. Then he is using someone else's identity. Several customers exchanged uneasy glances. The elderly woman who had been observing everything finally stood and approached the customer service area. Excuse me, she said politely. Has this gentleman actually done anything wrong? Richard forced a professional smile. Ma'am, we are following proper security procedures. I understand, she replied. But I asked whether he has actually done anything wrong. Richard did not answer. The silence lingered just long enough for more customers to notice. Nathaniel remained seated exactly where he had been for the past several minutes. He looked neither embarrassed nor defensive. His eyes briefly returned to the large clock above the lobby. 10:15, right on schedule. At that exact moment, his phone vibrated once inside his pocket. He glanced at the screen without unlocking it, then quietly slipped it back. Richard noticed immediately. Who keeps contacting you? Nathaniel answered calmly. Someone making sure I arrived safely. Richard scoffed. Tell them not to bother. You are not going anywhere until the police finish asking questions. Nathaniel simply nodded. That decision may not be yours. Across the room, the businessman waiting for his commercial loan appointment slowly lowered his coffee cup. Something about this does not add up, he whispered. Another customer nodded in agreement. Even the security officer now looked toward the front entrance instead of Nathaniel. The sound of the sirens had stopped. Through the tall glass windows, 2 police cruisers rolled quietly into the parking lot. Richard straightened his jacket with visible satisfaction, convinced the next few minutes would validate every assumption he had made. Emily, however, felt an entirely different emotion. As she stared once more at the confidential meeting notice glowing on her screen, one unsettling thought refused to leave her mind. Whoever had scheduled that meeting clearly expected Nathaniel Brooks to be inside the building at exactly 10:15, and according to the bank's own secure system, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The glass door slid open with a quiet hiss as 2 Charlotte police officers stepped into the lobby, their measured pace immediately drawing every eye in the room. The conversation stopped again. Even the soft background music seemed to disappear beneath the sudden weight of expectation. Officer Daniel Harris, a veteran with nearly 2 decades on the force, scanned the lobby before looking directly at Richard Coleman. Beside him, Officer Melissa Carter carried a small notepad but made no move toward anyone. They had responded to hundreds of calls over the years, and both had learned that the loudest voice was not always the most accurate one. Richard hurried toward them with visible relief. Thank you for getting here so quickly, he said. This man has been attempting to gain unauthorized access to our executive banking area. His story keeps changing, and we believe something fraudulent is happening. Officer Harris nodded politely, but did not immediately look at Nathaniel. Has anyone been threatened? No, Richard admitted. Has anyone been injured? No. Has he refused lawful instructions? Richard hesitated. He refuses to explain himself. Officer Harris glanced across the lobby toward Nathaniel Brooks, who remained seated exactly where he had been moments earlier. His leather folder still rested across his lap. His hands remained folded. There was nothing about his posture suggesting panic or confrontation. The officer walked over at an unhurried pace. Good morning, sir. I am Officer Harris. May I ask your name? Nathaniel stood respectfully before answering. Nathaniel Brooks. Would you mind telling me what brought you here today? I arrived for a scheduled executive meeting at 10:15 this morning. The answer was delivered so calmly that Officer Harris instinctively glanced back toward Richard. Has anyone confirmed whether such a meeting exists? Richard immediately interrupted. There is no reason to believe that story. Before Officer Harris could respond, Emily Foster spoke from behind her workstation, her voice careful but clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. Actually, there is an executive conference room reserved for 10:15. The reservation is listed under confidential executive authorization. Richard turned sharply. Emily, that information is restricted. I know, she answered quietly. But it is there. The room seemed to grow even quieter. Several customers who had been pretending not to listen now openly watched the exchange. Officer Melissa Carter stepped toward Emily. Are you saying the bank's own scheduling system shows a meeting at this exact time? Emily nodded. Yes, ma'am. Richard quickly regained his composure. That proves nothing. Anyone can claim they belong at a meeting. Nathaniel remained silent. He did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. Instead, he looked toward the officers with the same composed expression he had carried since entering the building. Officer Harris noticed the contrast immediately. One person continued making accusations. The other answered only when asked. The difference was becoming difficult to ignore. Near the entrance, the elderly woman folded her arms and quietly addressed no one in particular. Respectfully, this gentleman has shown more patience than most people would. A few customers nodded almost instinctively. Richard sensed the room beginning to shift away from him, and the realization made his voice noticeably louder. Do not let appearances fool you. People planning financial crimes often act calm. Officer Harris neither agreed nor disagreed. Instead, he turned back toward Nathaniel. Sir, do you have any objection to remaining here while we verify the facts? Nathaniel offered a courteous smile. None at all, officer. In fact, I would appreciate it if everyone stayed exactly where they are. I believe someone will be arriving very shortly, and I think it would be best if they found the situation exactly as it happened. Those words lingered in the lobby longer than anyone expected. Richard dismissed them with a confident shake of his head, believing they were nothing more than another attempt to delay the inevitable. Emily, however, felt her pulse quicken as the confidential appointment on her computer quietly changed status from scheduled to guest arrived, a system update that could only be triggered by someone with the highest level of executive authorization within the entire organization. Ignoring the growing tension surrounding him, Nathaniel Brooks slowly returned to his seat as though the arrival of the police had changed nothing at all. That single act of composure unsettled the room more than any dramatic reaction could have. Customers had expected arguments, raised voices, perhaps even a desperate attempt to explain himself. Instead, they watched a man who seemed perfectly comfortable waiting for time to reveal whatever he already knew. A young customer standing near the investment office quietly lifted his phone and began recording. Within seconds, another customer followed, aiming her camera toward the center of the lobby. Richard Coleman immediately pointed toward them. Please put those away. Recording inside the bank is not permitted. The young man hesitated but kept his phone raised. Before Richard could repeat himself, Nathaniel spoke for the first time in nearly a minute. Please do not post anything online. His calm voice drew every eye back toward him. Let the facts arrive before opinions do. The young customer lowered his phone slightly, surprised by the request. Sir, after what happened to you, people should see this. Nathaniel offered a polite smile. Justice does not become stronger because it goes viral. It becomes stronger when it is true. The words lingered across the lobby. Even Officer Melissa Carter glanced toward him with quiet respect. Richard folded his arms, clearly frustrated that the attention he had hoped would validate his actions was instead drifting toward the quiet man he had accused. Near the customer service desk, the elderly woman stepped closer. Young man, she said gently to Nathaniel, you have shown remarkable patience. Nathaniel nodded respectfully. Thank you, ma'am. Anger has never helped me arrive at the truth any faster. Emily Foster looked up from her computer once more. The confidential appointment continued displaying the same unusual status. Guest arrived. Executive notification sent. She had never seen those words appear before. Her training manual had mentioned executive protocols only briefly, describing them as procedures reserved for the highest level of organizational leadership. Ordinary branch employees were never expected to encounter one. She quietly opened another internal window, hoping to understand what the notification meant. Instead of granting access, the system displayed a simple message. Restricted. Executive operations only. Emily slowly leaned back in her chair. Richard noticed her expression immediately. Emily, stop searching for things that do not concern you, he said sharply. She looked toward him before answering. Sir, I think something important is happening. Richard dismissed her concern with a wave of his hand. The only important thing happening is that we prevented a security risk. Officer Harris remained unconvinced. Throughout his career, he had learned that people telling the truth rarely needed to embellish it. Nathaniel answered only direct questions. Richard, meanwhile, seemed determined to add another accusation every few minutes. The contrast became harder to ignore. A businessman who had been quietly waiting for nearly half an hour finally spoke. Officer, With respect, this gentleman has cooperated with every request. Maybe everyone should slow down before making conclusions. Several customers murmured in agreement. Richard felt the room slipping further from his control. You are all missing the bigger picture, he insisted. This is exactly how professional fraud works. Confidence, patience, manipulation. Nathaniel looked toward him without anger. Confidence and patience are not evidence of wrongdoing, Mr. Coleman. Richard blinked. How do you know my name? A brief silence settled over the lobby. Nathaniel answered with complete sincerity. Because I made it my business to know who manages this branch. Before Richard could respond, Emily's computer emitted a soft notification tone unlike any she had heard before. Every executive calendar on her screen disappeared instantly, replaced by a single line of text in bold blue letters. Executive delegation entering building. Estimated arrival, 1 minute. Emily's eyes widened. She slowly looked toward the front entrance, then back at Nathaniel Brooks. For the first time since the morning had begun, she realized the quiet man sitting in the leather chair had never once looked uncertain. He had simply been waiting for everyone else to catch up to the truth. Richard Coleman forced a confident smile, but the confidence no longer reached his eyes. The atmosphere inside the branch had shifted in a way he could not control. Only minutes earlier, every face in the lobby had been turned toward Nathaniel Brooks with suspicion. Now those same faces were watching Richard instead, measuring every word, every decision, every expression. He refused to surrender the authority he believed belonged to him. This changes nothing, Richard declared, raising his voice once again. Executive notifications do not prove this man belongs here. Emily Foster looked away from her monitor and spoke more firmly than she had all morning. Sir, I have never seen this protocol before, but it is clearly authentic. The system locked me out automatically. Richard immediately cut her off. Then stopped looking at it. Officer Daniel Harris quietly observed the exchange without interrupting. Experience had taught him that pressure revealed character better than questions ever could. Nathaniel remained seated with relaxed shoulders while Richard appeared increasingly determined to win an argument that no one else seemed interested in having. Officer Melissa Carter stepped toward Emily's workstation. May I see the notification? Emily nodded and turned the monitor slightly. Melissa studied the screen for several seconds before looking back toward Richard. This appears to be an internal executive system. We cannot interpret what it means, but it is clearly active. Richard folded his arms. Exactly. None of us know what it means, so we continue treating this as a security matter. Nathaniel finally spoke. You are free to continue following your procedures, Mr. Coleman. I only ask that everyone remain patient for another minute. Richard let out a frustrated laugh. You keep talking about 1 more minute. 1 more person. 1 more explanation. I am finished waiting. He turned toward Officer Harris. I would like him escorted from the executive area until corporate confirms whatever story he is telling. Officer Harris remained calm. Sir, he is already cooperating. There is no immediate reason to remove him. The answer clearly disappointed Richard. Then at least have him wait outside. Nathaniel slowly stood, not because anyone had ordered him to, but because he heard the quiet sound of elevator doors opening at the far end of the executive hallway. His eyes shifted briefly toward the corridor before returning to Officer Harris. Officer, I have no objection to remaining exactly where I am. My meeting appears to be arriving. Several customers instinctively turned toward the hallway, although nothing could yet be seen from the lobby. The silence deepened. Even the security officer stationed near the entrance found himself looking in the same direction. Emily noticed another notification appear across her monitor. Executive delegation has entered restricted floor. Branch leadership notification active. She quietly read the message twice to make certain she had not misunderstood it. Her pulse quickened. Richard noticed her expression again. What now? Emily answered honestly. The delegation is already inside the building. Richard shook his head dismissively. Fine. Let them come. They will tell us whether this man belongs here. Nathaniel's expression remained composed. They certainly will. The businessman waiting for his commercial loan glanced toward the elderly woman beside him and whispered, He sounds like someone who already knows the outcome. She nodded slowly. Because I think he does. At that exact moment, polished dress shoes echoed across the marble floor beyond the hallway entrance. The sound was steady, unhurried, and purposeful. One by one, Every conversation inside the branch disappeared. Every customer, every employee, every officer turned toward the approaching footsteps. Nathaniel did not move. He simply watched the hallway with the quiet certainty of someone welcoming expected guests rather than awaiting rescue. Nathaniel Brooks never turned toward the approaching footsteps. He did not need to. The sound alone carried him somewhere else, somewhere 24 years earlier when polished dress shoes had echoed across another bank lobby for a very different reason. Back then, he was 24 years old, wearing the only Navy suit he could afford after saving for months from his first commercial real estate commissions. Every document was organized inside a simple accordion folder. Every financial projection had been reviewed dozens of times. He had walked into a neighborhood bank asking for a small business loan to purchase his first office building. The numbers supported him. His credit was excellent. His down payment exceeded the minimum requirement. Yet before anyone studied a single page, an employee had looked at him, then quietly disappeared into a manager's office. A few minutes later, another man appeared, not with approval papers, but with guarded questions that had little to do with finance. They asked whether the documents truly belonged to him. They asked whether someone else would be guaranteeing the loan. They asked how someone his age could possibly have accumulated enough money for commercial property. Nathaniel remembered answering every question with patience because he believed facts always defeated assumptions. They did not. The meeting ended with polite smiles, a rejected application, and a sentence he never forgot. Perhaps you should begin with something more realistic. Walking back to his aging pickup truck that afternoon, Nathaniel had not been angry. He had been disappointed. The rejection was not simply about capital. It was about imagination. Someone had looked at him and decided success belonged to someone else. Sitting behind the steering wheel, he made himself a promise that remained sharper than any contract he had ever signed. One day, he would build a company large enough that no young entrepreneur would have to wonder whether appearance mattered more than preparation. That promise became longer workdays, missed holidays, difficult negotiations, failed partnerships, early mornings, and countless flights across the country. It became one investment property, then another, then an entire portfolio stretching across multiple states. Years later, it became Brooks Capital, a company built not only on financial discipline, but on the belief that respect should never depend on clothing, skin color, or first impressions. The memory faded as quickly as it had arrived. Nathaniel returned to the present with the same steady expression that had carried him through decades of boardrooms and negotiations. Around him, the lobby remained perfectly still. Richard Coleman interpreted the silence differently. "You still think someone is coming to save you," he said with a faint smile. Nathaniel met his eyes. "No, Mr. Coleman. I think someone is coming to reveal the truth." Richard shook his head. "Truth does not change policy." Nathaniel answered quietly. "Good policy is built on truth." Officer Daniel Harris noticed the exchange without speaking. Emily Foster continued staring toward the executive hallway, where the footsteps were now unmistakably closer. Every measured step echoed across the marble floor with calm confidence rather than urgency. Whatever was approaching did not sound like a crisis. It sounded like people arriving exactly where they intended to be. Richard straightened his tie once more, convinced he was about to receive validation from corporate leadership. Nathaniel simply rested one hand on the leather folder he had protected all morning. His breathing never changed. His posture never shifted. He looked less like a man waiting for judgment than someone preparing to begin the meeting he had scheduled from the very start. Nathaniel Brooks reached into his pocket with the same measured confidence that had defined every moment since he entered the branch. No one rushed toward him. No one tried to stop him. Even Richard Coleman seemed curious now, convinced that whatever happened next would finally expose the story he believed Nathaniel had invented. Nathaniel unlocked his phone, selected a single contact, and raised it to his ear. The call connected almost immediately. "Good morning, Olivia," he said calmly. "Please begin Protocol 7. There was no panic on the other end. No questions. Only a composed female voice answered without hesitation. "Confirmed, Mr. Brooks. Protocol 7 is now active. Regional leadership has already been notified. Executive Legal has received the incident report. Internal compliance has secured the branch records, and the corporate audit team is preserving all access logs, surveillance footage, and communication records beginning at 9:45 this morning." Nathaniel simply replied, "Thank you." He ended the call, and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Richard let out a dismissive laugh. That was supposed to impress us? Nathaniel looked at him quietly. No, it was meant to inform the people who needed to know. Richard shook his head. You think pretending to call executives changes anything? Nathaniel answered with complete sincerity. I have never needed to pretend. Emily Foster felt another notification appear across her monitor. This time, several windows closed automatically before a new message filled the center of the screen. Compliance lock initiated. Local administrative access suspended. Await executive review. She blinked twice. Then she attempted to access the branch administration menu. The system denied every request. Sir, she whispered almost to herself, our management controls are locked. Richard turned immediately. What are you talking about? I cannot access administrative functions anymore. Try again. Emily did. The answer remained exactly the same. Officer Daniel Harris noticed the growing concern behind the counter. Is there a technical issue? Emily looked honestly overwhelmed. I do not know. I have never seen this before. Near the entrance, the branch security officer quietly checked his own handheld device. The screen briefly refreshed before displaying a notice that branch security authority had been transferred to executive operations until further notice. He frowned but said nothing. Across the lobby, customers sensed another invisible shift. Nothing dramatic had happened. No alarm sounded. No one raised a voice. Yet the building itself seemed to be quietly changing hands through systems none of them could see. Richard reached for the telephone behind the service desk and dialed the regional office himself. Instead of connecting immediately, he was greeted by an automated message informing him that all management inquiries regarding the current branch status would be addressed by the executive response team. His expression changed for the first time that morning. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but enough for Officer Melissa Carter to recognize uncertainty replacing confidence. Nathaniel remained exactly where he stood. Mr. Coleman, he said gently. Sometimes the truth arrives long before people are willing to recognize it. Richard lowered the receiver without answering. Before another word could be spoken, the elevator doors at the end of the executive corridor opened completely. Four professionally dressed men and women stepped into view, walking toward the lobby with calm precision. At their center was a silver-haired woman carrying a black portfolio embossed with the Brooks Capital logo. Every employee behind the counter instinctively straightened their posture. Emily recognized two of the faces immediately from corporate leadership announcements distributed throughout the company. They were not visiting the branch by coincidence. They were walking directly toward Nathaniel Brooks with the unmistakable confidence of people arriving to meet the person they had come to see. Nobody in the lobby spoke as the executive delegation crossed the polished marble floor. Their pace was steady, their expressions composed, and every step seemed to erase another layer of certainty from Richard Coleman's face. The silver-haired woman leading the group stopped directly in front of Nathaniel Brooks before offering a respectful smile. Good morning, Mr. Brooks, she said. I apologize for the delay. Traffic from the airport took slightly longer than expected. Nathaniel returned the smile with a simple nod. Good morning, Evelyn. Thank you for coming. The entire branch fell silent. Richard stared at the exchange as though he had suddenly forgotten where he was. Emily Foster immediately recognized the woman. Evelyn Mitchell was the executive vice president of corporate operations, a leader whose quarterly messages were distributed to every branch across the country. She would never travel to a local office without an extraordinary reason. Standing beside Evelyn were Regional Director Thomas Reynolds, Chief Compliance Officer Angela Pierce, and Senior Corporate Counsel David Langley. None of them acknowledged Richard first. Every greeting, every glance, every word was directed toward Nathaniel. Officer Daniel Harris quietly exchanged a look with Officer Melissa Carter. Whatever they had expected when responding to the call, this had not been it. Evelyn turned toward the officers with calm professionalism. Thank you for remaining here. We appreciate your patience while we verified the circumstances. Officer Harris nodded politely. We are simply here to establish the facts. As are we, Evelyn replied. Richard finally stepped forward, forcing a nervous smile. I am Richard Coleman, branch manager. I am glad corporate has arrived, because this individual has been making claims about executive meetings and restricted access. Evelyn looked at Richard for the first time. Her expression remained courteous, but noticeably reserved. We are fully aware of the situation, Mr. Coleman. Richard quickly continued. Then you know we acted to protect the bank. Before Evelyn could answer, Angela Pierce opened a slim tablet and quietly reviewed several documents. Security footage has already been secured, she said. Access logs have been preserved. Telephone records, internal messages, and transaction history have all been placed under legal retention. Richard blinked. Legal retention? David Langley answered evenly. Standard procedure whenever Executive Protocol 7 is activated. Emily heard several customers quietly repeat the unfamiliar phrase to one another. Richard looked from one executive to another. There must be some misunderstanding. Nathaniel calmly lifted the leather folder he had protected throughout the morning and handed it to Evelyn. She accepted it with both hands before saying, "Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Brooks." Richard frowned. "Why are you addressing him like that?" No one answered immediately. The silence itself became heavier than any explanation. Around the lobby, customers leaned forward without realizing it. Even the security officer lowered his radio, sensing that the moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. Officer Harris looked toward Nathaniel. "Sir, would you like to clarify your role here?" Nathaniel glanced briefly around the room, meeting the eyes of Emily, the officers, the customers, and finally Richard Coleman. His voice remained calm, measured, and unmistakably confident. "I will. But before I do, I would like everyone present to remember something very simple. Every decision made this morning was based on who people believed I was, not on a single verified fact." No one interrupted him. Richard's confident posture had completely disappeared. For the first time that morning, he looked less like the manager controlling the room and more like a man realizing the room had never truly belonged to him at all. Nathaniel Brooks let the silence settle before speaking again. He did not rush the moment because the truth had never needed speed to carry its weight. He looked toward Evelyn Mitchell, who gave a slight nod. Then he turned back to the people who had spent the past half hour trying to decide whether he belonged inside the building. "My name is Nathaniel Brooks," he said evenly. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Brooks Capital Holdings." Several customers exchanged confused glances. The name sounded familiar, but few immediately understood its significance. Nathaniel continued before anyone could interrupt. 6 weeks ago, Brooks Capital completed the acquisition of Horizon Financial Group, including every regional branch operating under this charter. Emily Foster quietly covered her mouth as the realization struck her all at once. The confidential executive calendar, the restricted access, the automated system changes, the arrival of senior leadership, every unexplained detail suddenly fit together with perfect clarity. Richard Coleman stared at Nathaniel without speaking. His expression shifted from disbelief to confusion, then slowly toward the unmistakable recognition that the assumptions guiding every decision he had made that morning had collapsed beneath him. Evelyn Mitchell stepped forward holding the black portfolio. "For the record," she said calmly, "Mr. Brooks scheduled today's visit personally. This meeting was intended to evaluate operational culture, customer experience, and executive readiness within this branch." Angela Pierce gently placed her tablet on the customer service counter. Protocol 7 was designed specifically for unannounced executive observations. Every interaction that occurred this morning has already been documented. Officer Daniel Harris looked toward Nathaniel with quiet respect. "Sir, I appreciate your cooperation throughout this situation." Nathaniel nodded. "Thank you, officer. You asked questions before reaching conclusions. I respect that." Officer Melissa Carter added, "Our responsibility is to establish facts, and I believe we now have them." Richard finally found his voice. "Mr. Brooks, if I had known." Nathaniel looked directly at him, not with anger, but with unmistakable disappointment. "That is precisely the problem, Mr. Coleman." The room became completely still. "If you had known my title, my position, or my authority, this morning would have unfolded very differently. But respect that depends on someone's job title is not respect. It is convenience." No one attempted to disagree. Nathaniel slowly looked around the lobby, meeting the eyes of customers who had witnessed everything from beginning to end. "You did not verify who I was before deciding who I could be. You looked at my clothes, my appearance, and the color of my skin before you looked at the facts sitting in your own system." Emily lowered her eyes. remembering how every answer had been available inside the bank's records from the beginning. Richard remained frozen where he stood. The confidence that had filled his voice only minutes earlier had completely disappeared. Nathaniel continued in the same measured tone. You called law enforcement before confirming a scheduled executive appointment. You questioned my identity after your own records verified it. You assumed wrongdoing where patience and professionalism would have revealed the truth. Around the lobby, several customers slowly nodded. The elderly woman folded her hands with quiet satisfaction, while the businessman waiting for his appointment whispered. He never raised his voice once. Nathaniel heard the comment, but offered no response. He simply looked toward Evelyn and the executive delegation, who stood beside him with complete confidence. Without another announcement or dramatic gesture, everyone present now understood exactly who had been sitting in the leather chair since 10:12 that morning, quietly waiting for the truth to arrive on its own. No one moved. The lobby that had been filled with confident opinions only minutes earlier now stood suspended in complete silence, as though the building itself had paused to absorb what had just been revealed. Richard Coleman looked around the room searching for something that could restore the certainty he had carried all morning, but every familiar face now reflected the same question back at him. How had this happened? Evelyn Mitchell broke the silence with calm professionalism. Mr. Brooks requested an unannounced operational review because customer trust begins long before financial transactions. It begins with the first greeting, the first assumption, and the first decision made by the people representing this institution. Angela Pierce tapped her tablet once. The complete timeline has already been assembled. Surveillance footage confirms that Mr. Brooks remained cooperative from the moment he entered the branch. Internal system records confirm that his executive meeting was scheduled in advance. Branch employees successfully verified his identity. Those findings were available before law enforcement was contacted. Richard lowered his eyes. Every statement removed another excuse before he could reach for it. Emily Foster quietly stepped forward from behind her workstation. Mr. Brooks, she said with genuine sincerity, I should have spoken sooner. I saw that the system was confirming your appointment, but I allowed uncertainty to keep me quiet. Nathaniel looked at her with a calm expression. You eventually chose facts over assumptions. That matters more than pretending you never hesitated. Emily nodded, visibly relieved but still humbled by the lesson. Officer Daniel Harris looked toward Richard before speaking carefully. Our department responded because assistance was requested. We appreciate the cooperation shown by everyone present, especially Mr. Brooks, who remained respectful throughout the entire interaction. Officer Melissa Carter added, situations become much easier when people verify information before reaching conclusions. Several customers quietly agreed. The businessman waiting for his appointment spoke first. I watched every minute of this. The only person who stayed consistent from beginning to end was Mr. Brooks. The elderly woman smiled gently. Real confidence never needed to become loud. Richard finally looked directly at Nathaniel. There is no excuse for how I handled this morning. Nathaniel answered without satisfaction or anger, acknowledging that is the beginning of accountability. Whether it becomes real accountability depends on what happens next. Evelyn glanced toward Angela, who nodded before opening another document on her tablet. Executive Compliance has already initiated a formal review of every action taken during today's incident, including management decisions, policy application, and communication procedures. The purpose is not simply to determine individual responsibility, but to evaluate whether similar patterns exist elsewhere. Nathaniel slowly walked toward the center of the lobby, looking not only at the employees but also at the customers who had witnessed everything unfold. Many people believe discrimination begins with hatred, he said quietly. In my experience, it usually begins with unchecked assumptions. Someone decides who belongs before asking who they are. Someone mistakes appearance for evidence. Someone confuses confidence with suspicion because it comes from the wrong person. The words settled deeply across the room. Emily lowered her head in reflection. Even Richard listened without interruption. Nathaniel continued. The most important lesson from this morning is not that I happen to be the chief executive officer. The lesson is that every customer deserves the same fairness I received only after my title became known. If dignity depends on position, then dignity is not being offered equally. Around the lobby, several customers nodded quietly. No applause followed. None was needed. The truth itself had become the loudest voice in the building. And for the first time that morning, every person inside understood that the greatest mistake had never been failing to recognize Nathaniel Brooks. It had been deciding his value before taking the time to recognize his humanity. The weight of the morning settled over the branch with remarkable quiet. No one celebrated. No one argued. The silence itself had become a mirror, forcing everyone to confront the difference between policy and judgment. Nathaniel Brooks slowly closed the leather folder that had remained untouched since he first walked through the front doors. It was never the documents inside that had been tested. It had been the people standing around them. Evelyn Mitchell looked toward Richard Coleman before speaking with measured professionalism. "Mr. Coleman, effective immediately, your management authority over this branch is suspended pending the outcome of the executive review initiated under Protocol 7. Richard lowered his head. He did not protest. He seemed to understand that the decision had not been made during the past minute. It had been shaped by every choice he made throughout the morning. Angela Pierce continued reading from her tablet. "Your administrative credentials have already been deactivated. Temporary branch leadership will be assigned by regional operations while the review proceeds according to corporate policy." At nearly the same moment, Emily Foster noticed the branch management profile disappear from her system. Richard's name no longer appeared beside the branch manager designation. The screen refreshed, replacing it with temporary executive oversight. She quietly looked toward Nathaniel before returning her eyes to the monitor. The change had happened without raised voices, without dramatic announcements, and without humiliation. It was simply the consequence of documented decisions. Officer Daniel Harris stepped toward Richard with a respectful nod. "Our involvement here is complete. There are no criminal findings related to Mr. Brooks based on the information established today." Richard answered softly. "Understood, officer." Officer Melissa Carter thanked the executive team for their cooperation before both officers prepared to leave. As they reached the entrance, Officer Harris turned back briefly toward Nathaniel. "Sir, thank you for your patience today." Nathaniel smiled. "Thank you for allowing facts to guide your decisions." After the officers departed, several customers quietly resumed their business, but the atmosphere inside the branch no longer resembled the one that had existed less than an hour earlier. Conversations sounded gentler. Employees looked more carefully at the people standing before them. Emily approached Nathaniel once more. "Mr. Brooks, I hope this branch earns another opportunity to demonstrate the values it should have shown from the beginning." Nathaniel answered warmly. "Cultures change one decision at a time. Today becomes meaningful only if tomorrow looks different." Evelyn nodded in agreement. "That is exactly why this review extends beyond one individual. We will examine hiring practices, customer interactions, management training, and reporting procedures throughout the organization. Trust must be built into the culture, not left to chance." Nathaniel looked across the lobby one final time. The marble floors, polished counters, and executive offices had not changed. The people inside them had. Some had discovered courage. Others had discovered accountability. All of them had witnessed how quickly assumptions could collapse when confronted by truth. Richard quietly collected his personal notebook from his office desk before walking back into the lobby. He paused for a moment, looked toward Nathaniel, and offered a sincere nod of acknowledgement. Nathaniel returned the gesture without resentment. Justice, he had learned long ago, was never about humiliating another person. It was about creating enough honesty that the same mistake would be less likely to happen to the next person who walked through those doors. Nathaniel Brooks remained in the lobby for another few quiet moments, watching ordinary life slowly return to the branch. Customers stepped back into the teller lines. Phones disappeared into pockets. Conversations resumed, softer than before, as though everyone understood they had witnessed something larger than a disagreement inside a bank. They had watched assumptions collide with truth, and truth had required neither anger nor spectacle to prevail. Nathaniel walked toward the front entrance with Evelyn Mitchell and the executive delegation beside him. Just before reaching the doors, he paused and looked back one final time. Emily Foster was already helping an elderly customer with the same patience and attention every person deserved. The security officer greeted a family entering the branch with a genuine smile. Even the atmosphere felt different, lighter somehow, as if the building itself had been reminded of its purpose. Evelyn quietly asked, Would you like me to schedule another surprise visit in a few months? Nathaniel smiled. No. If today's lesson only works when I am watching, then we have not changed anything at all. Evelyn nodded. Fair point. She closed her portfolio. The culture review begins this afternoon. Every branch will receive updated guidance. Nathaniel looked through the tall glass windows toward the busy Charlotte streets where people from every background crossed paths without knowing one another's stories. Policies matter, he said, but culture determines whether those policies are lived or ignored. Outside, the warm morning air greeted them as they stepped onto the sidewalk. The city continued moving as though nothing extraordinary had happened, yet for everyone inside that branch the day would remain unforgettable. Richard Coleman quietly exited the building several minutes later carrying a small cardboard box containing his personal belongings. He noticed Nathaniel preparing to enter a waiting sedan and walked over with measured steps. There was no audience now, no customers watching, no executives standing between them. Only two men sharing one final conversation. Richard stopped a respectful distance away. Mr. Brooks, he said sincerely, I cannot change what happened this morning, but I can learn from it. I hope I do. Nathaniel looked at him calmly. Learning begins the moment excuses end. I hope you carry that lesson wherever you go next. Richard nodded once. I will. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the parking lot, leaving behind not only a position but a morning that would shape the rest of his career. Nathaniel watched him for a moment before entering the car. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, he looked once more at the branch growing smaller in the rear window. More than 2 decades earlier, one disappointing visit to a bank had inspired him to build something better. Today, another visit had reminded him why that promise still mattered. Success had never been about proving strangers wrong. It had always been about creating places where the next person would be judged by character instead of appearance. Long after the executives departed and the morning settled into memory, one sentence remained with everyone who had stood inside that lobby. Nathaniel had spoken it without raising his voice, yet it carried farther than any accusation ever could. The strongest institution is not the one with the tallest building or the largest balance sheet. It is the one where every person is treated with equal dignity before anyone asks who they are. And with that quiet truth, the day finally came to its proper end.